Morning everybody, and welcome to what is sadly very much my plan B for today. Plan A was to be on that pier, but after a little conversation with the maintenance man, it's very clear that it's actually not open for another 4 hours. So clearly needed to do a little bit more research. Anyway, it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this video. I've come along the Great Orme Road instead, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a subject that's very dear to my heart, which is handheld photos and getting sharp handheld photos, on the basis that I absolutely despise tripods. So I get asked about it a lot, and I don't have one place on the internet to sort of send people to for all of my tips. There's no kind of collated video where all of the things that I've learned over the past few years lives. So that is the purpose of this video, and I'm fast running out of low light after the kerfuffle on the pier. So just got to get on with it. Tip number one is no coffee, which is tricky on a morning like this because you literally have to drag yourself out of bed if you're anything like me. But coffee, regardless of how caffeine resilient you think you are, can make you a little bit jittery, obviously. So yeah, avoiding coffee when you're trying to take steady photos is a good first step, I think. Lovely morning. No, this is not going well. I had hoped to have this entire video sewn up by the time sunrise came, but that's about 15 minutes away, and I'm on point 2 of 10 or 11, can't remember, so that's not going to happen. But anyway, point 2 is avoiding not eating food. Bit of a weird double negative, that. Eat food, basically. Avoid coffee, but eat food, for much the same reason to avoid the hunger shakes. You don't get hunger shakes with coffee, you know what I mean. So yeah, I pack a couple of bananas or something usually for a morning like this, and it just keeps hunger at bay, although it's a bit risky when there are this many seagulls around. Not been attacked yet. And yeah, to tell you the truth, I'd say those are the trickiest things about mornings like this for me. Not having coffee and having to eat when normally I don't really like to eat before 12 of a day. Yeah, don't really like it, but worth it for the higher probability of sharp photos. It's not even dark anymore, I'm talking about low light. Tip number 3 for shooting in low light, so not like this, is to use the self timer. So typically I'll use the 2-second timer, and that just means that you're limiting the risk that your finger's movement on the shutter is going to cause any movement of the sensor. So yeah, using the 2-second timer works a charm. Unless you're trying to capture an exact moment, in which case trying to work out when you're exactly 2 seconds ahead of that can be a bit of a challenge. But for the most part, I find, at least in low light, that I'm not really trying to do that. Tip number 4 is to use your electronic shutter, which I just did then. I tried to time my talking so that you could hear the electronic shutter, but it's just a fake noise. And quite a quiet one as well. So basically, when you use your mechanical shutter, let me go into the menu and change that. There's a physical movement within the camera when the shutter goes. And that can cause a little bit of shock, can cause some movement, and therefore you might end up with a less sharp image than if you use your electronic shutter, which doesn't cause that. Now, there are times when using an electronic shutter might not be quite as good. You might end up with things like rolling shutter. That's a bit of a problem in some circumstances. But to be honest, in landscapes where you've not got loads of straight lines everywhere, it's not usually a problem. And yeah, it can just result in a tiny bit less camera movement, I find. I'm afraid to say that the rest of this low light video will be done while the sun's up. Bit of a fail. How's that for a view? This bench is in a prime spot, except I'm now just staring straight at my my failure, and it's blinding me. Anyway, this is my GoPro, and it's a tiny little camera, but it's got the best stabilization I've ever seen in a camera. Point being, stabilization has come a really long way in the last few years, I suppose, and it used to be that you could only really get reliable stabilization within lenses. Now you can get it in bodies too, and sometimes the stabilization in bodies and in lenses can work together to provide 6.5 stops of stabilization. That's not uncommon anymore. And that is going to be a huge help if you can get your hand on one of those bodies or those lenses or those systems to helping you get really sharp shots, regardless of how good your technique is or how little coffee you manage to drink. So yeah, having a stabilized body / lens / both is really helpful. I'm going to move now because I am getting blinded. I suppose the perk of it not being nighttime anymore is that I can fly the drone. And what a morning it is to fly a drone. Well, tip number 6 for taking photos in low light, you got to laugh, haven't you, is to keep your legs apart. Now, I see lots of people taking photos like this, but the fact is that if you get a gust of wind, it's going to sway you and the camera, so it's not a particularly stable position. So what you want to do is keep your legs apart, feet apart, sorry, both front to back and side to side. So sort of stand 45 degrees onto your subject. And then what you want to do is keep your head exactly in the middle of your feet. Your head is one of the heaviest parts of your body, so if you can keep that in between your feet, you're doing pretty good. Basically what I mean by that is don't sort of lean over one leg or lean over the back leg, because eventually that weight is going to be telling for that leg. It's going to get tired and it'll end up starting to shake. And it's also just not stable. So yes, the position is something like this, sort of a warrior type pose. Is this warrior pose? I'm not too hot on my yoga poses. Now, all of this applies when you sat down or in positions other than standing too. So you want to keep your head somewhere between your feet and your back if you sat down, something like this, as opposed to like this or like this. Yeah, head between your feet and your back. Also, it might be tempting if you want to kneel down to be something like this, but in actual fact, you're much more stable, spreading your feet apart again, and once again, trying to keep your head between your feet. It's quite straightforward, but I do find it helps. Right, I'm sure I will move on from this bench area eventually, but based on the current height of the sun, I've been here for over an hour. It's a lovely spot. Anyway, weight of the camera. I like to keep the entire weight of the camera and lens in my left hand, and then my right hand is just responsible for pressing buttons. So my left arm is tucked in really tight against my body, whole weight of the camera in my left hand. This is just for fiddling, and I'll obviously keep the camera against my eye for an extra point of contact too. Now, I'm not saying this will work for you, but it definitely works for me. And if you're in the quest for sharper handheld shots, might be worth a go. Also, breathing. I find personally I'm at my steadiest when I'm breathing out. So I like to try and breathe out or be breathing out while the shutter is exposing, which can take a little bit of practice if you're using the self-timer. But yeah, you get used to it quite quickly. I'll give you a little demo. So, 2-second timer. Observe that I'm paying no attention to the stance advice that I've literally just given you, but that was just a demo of the breath. I find it works for me, so maybe worth a go for you. This has really gone wrong this morning, but hey ho, it's a lovely part of the world for things to not go to plan in. And luckily for me, about 2 miles from my house. And you get a phone signal here, which is perfect in case Emily goes into labour. Still a couple of weeks from the due date, but you never know. My phone is not on silent. Oh, sheep in Wales, shock. Well, the Carneddau are over there, Conway is over there, Anglesea's over there. It's all very pretty, but as we know, pretty does not necessarily equal a good photo. And it's not even golden hour anymore. Definitely not blue hour anymore. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to mention was minimum shutter speed. Now, I'm not going to talk about it too much because I've done an entire video on minimum shutter speed, but basically the premise is as it sounds. You set a minimum shutter speed in your camera, if your camera has the feature, and basically your camera will do its best to make sure that your shutter speed never drops below that minimum shutter speed that you've set. So for example, if you feel comfortable that you can get a handheld sharp shot at a 30th of a second, you might set your minimum shutter speed for a 30th of a second, and your camera will then adjust other settings to make sure, or to try and make sure, that your shutter speed never drops below that. Yeah, It's not a bulletproof system, as I explained in that other video that I've just mentioned, but it's a pretty good way of making sure that you stand a good chance of getting a sharp shot if you don't have time to change all your settings and stuff before you get a photo. Also, bonus tip if you want to maximise your chances of getting sharp photos, wear appropriate footwear, not cycling shoes. You need something with a stable base, which is not these. Even though these are mountain bike ones and you're supposed to be able to walk in them, they're not what you'd call grippy. Another fairly obvious one, that.